Welcome to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of the Haunted Walk, offering ghost tours and paranormal adventures in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario, and online experiences to anyone in this mortal realm. My name is Jim Dean. I am the creative director, and it is my pleasure to be your haunted host for this episode. I always feel humbled and fortunate when extremely distinguished guests agree to join us on the show to talk about their work, which certainly is the case today. John Geiger has been serving in the role of CEO of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society since 2013. He is the internationally best-selling author of 7 books, including Frozen in Time, The Fate of the Franklin Expedition, The Third Man Factor, Surviving the Impossible, and Chapel of Extreme Experience, a short history of stroboscopic light and the Dream Machine. He has appeared on many television and radio programs and has been featured in major documentaries, including Arctic Ghost Ship on PBS Nova, The Angel Effect on National Geographic Channel's Explorer, and Flicker on Bravo. John graduated in history from the University of Alberta and is a senior fellow at Massey College in Toronto. He is the former chair of the editorial board of the Globe and Mail, and in 2021 was awarded with the Order of Canada. In his book, The Third Man Factor, he explores the mysterious and fascinating phenomenon of individuals experiencing the sensation of a third man or presence during moments of extreme stress or danger. From mountain climbers and explorers to prisoners of war and disaster survivors, Geiger examines numerous accounts of people reporting the feeling of an unexplained presence, aiding and guiding them through these harrowing experiences. Through extensive research and interviews with individuals who have experienced the third man, Geiger delves into the psychological and neurological underpinnings of this phenomenon. He explores various theories ranging from the supernatural and spiritual beliefs to scientific explanations. Up next is my discussion with John Geiger as we delve deeper into the third man factor, exploring the stories of those who have experienced it and the implications it has for our understanding of the paranormal, human consciousness, and resilience in the face of adversity. But before we get to that, last week I was able to share news of 2 of our tours, Ghosts of Fort Henry and Ghosts of Queen's University, restarting in Kingston, Ontario. In this episode, we put the spotlight on Toronto, which also has 2 tours which are about to wake up from a long and restful winter hibernation just in time for the May long weekend. Black Creek Pioneer Village really has it all. Some of the oldest buildings in the city, an incredible collection of spooky ghost stories, and it continues to be one of our most active sites, with guests and tour guides often getting some unexpected surprises along the way. The Ghosts of Black Creek Pioneer Village returns on Friday, May 19th. Starting the following day, Saturday, May 20th, we head back to school and launch our Campus Secrets and Spectres tour on the main campus of the University of Toronto. As we stroll through the historic grounds, our expert guides will captivate you with eerie stories of ghostly sightings and supernatural phenomena that have been witnessed by students, faculty, and visitors alike. Whether you're a history buff, a believer in the paranormal, a student or alum, or just looking for a unique and spooky evening out in Toronto, our Campus Secrets and Spectres tour will leave you with a sense of wonder and intrigue as we explore the haunted side of the University of Toronto's downtown campus. Don't forget, as a Haunted Talks listener, you can get 15% off your ghost tour tickets for any of our cities, Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, by using the promo code Haunted Talks when purchasing your tickets on our website, hauntedwalk.com. On the site, you can also find information about our at-home experiences, including the Haunting at Home and virtual haunted campfires, both of which can be enjoyed from anywhere in the world. Be sure to follow, rate, and review the show wherever you listen, and we hope you will connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and Twitter, all at Haunted Walk, for our latest updates, spooky memes, and spine-tingling tales. This is a conversation I've been looking forward to having for quite some time. John Geiger, welcome to Haunted Talks.
Thanks, Jim. Great to be here.
Our founder and CEO is Glenn Shackleton, who often jokes about his Uncle Ernie in reference to the famous Antarctic explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton, who is a key figure in what has become known as the Third Man phenomena. Could you explain the connection between Uncle Ernie, Ernest Shackleton, and the concept of the third man?
So I think, the most famous example of the sense-presence experience, which is really what the third man factor is the experience of Sir Ernest Shackleton and two other members of his British Imperial Trans-Antarctic expedition. So this is the very famous endurance expedition that Shackleton led. They were attempting on the ship Endurance, they're attempting to bisect Antarctica, going sledges. They never really got able to start the expedition. The ship was trapped in ice. It was subsequently crushed, and as you know, recently filmed at the bottom of the Weddell Sea. So Shackleton and his men had to abandon the ship. They were crossing this rotting ice. They were in absolutely terrible straits. The crew dragging food supplies and whatever they could with them, eventually launching these small boats that they had, making it to a place called Elephant Island where the bulk of the crew remained. And then Shackleton took a few men and made this absolutely harrowing crossing the Drake Passage to reach a place called South Georgia, which is a British possession in the South Atlantic. Fascinating place. I've been there. It's littered with seals and all sorts of different penguins. It's a really remarkable. It's like the Serengeti of the Antarctic. But it was an incredibly difficult journey, and the crossing by sea was horrifying. Then they finally got to South Georgia, and they then encountered a mountain range that they had to cross. They're on the wrong side of the island. They were trying to reach a whaling station, and they had to cross this mountain range. They were starving to death. They were literally starving. They were dehydrated. They were very cold. So it was just a horrific sort of a journey, but they made it and survived. But during that final leg of the expedition where they're crossing the mountains of South Georgia, all three of the man, Shackleton and his two colleagues, felt that there was a fourth with them, actually a fourth man, if you will, a presence. Shackleton described it as the divine companion. So it was this being that was filled with a benevolent kind of goodwill towards them and was urging them on. And he didn't mention it initially, but finally did raise it with the other two. And both of them confirmed that they had the same sensation. They felt that there was a fourth member of their party. So it was a very unusual experience that Shackleton recounted in his wonderful narrative, South, his account of that expedition. The great Anglo-American poet T.S. Eliot had come across this story, and Eliot incorporated almost like cut-ups, fragments of ideas and other literature and inspiration into his poetry. And so he, in The Wasteland, incorporated this reference to the fourth man Shackleton had encountered, except that he changed the number, I guess, with poetic license. And instead of being the fourth, it was the third man.
Here are the lines from The Wasteland. Who is the third that walks beside you? When I count, there are only you and I together. But when I look ahead up the white road, there is always another one walking beside you. Gliding, wrapped in a brown mantle, hooded, I do not know whether a man or a woman. But who is that on the other side of you?
So that's where the phenomenon gets its name and its third man factor. And it really originated with Shackleton. He's the one who really, I think, is most responsible for it being a concept that people recognize of, when they're under extreme duress. There is this encounter with a presence that is there to aid and encourage people during harrowing kind of often life and death survival scenarios. So, that's the most famous one. And that's where, for me, the journey to understand the phenomenon began.
I understand you've spent some time in the Arctic and have been involved with various expeditions. Could you share with us a little about your adventures in places that most of us will never have the chance or courage to visit, and if those experiences played a role in inspiring you to write the book?
Yes, I've been involved in a number of Arctic expeditions, primarily focused on the James Knight expedition, which was a 1719 English expedition led by a former governor of the Bay for the Hudson's Bay Company. And that expedition vanished off of the coast of Hudson Bay, a place called Marble Island, a very kind of eerie island group, really different from the surrounding geology in the sense that they're white quartzites. So the islands, from a distance, sort of stand apart from the kind of geology, and which is a sort of brownish, more earth tones. They are a special place for the Inuit. I spoke to elders from the community of Rankin Inlet, which is the nearest community to Marble Island, and they advised me and members of our party when we visited Marble Island, we must crawl up the beach on our elbows and knees to assuage the spirits there. So we certainly did that during each of the 3 field seasons. We were respecting the advice of the locals, and I've seen that local people themselves do the same thing. So it wasn't just a stunt for the benefit of some outside visitors. That was a fascinating expedition that had 29 men, 2 ships, and had simply vanished. I have also written a book called Frozen in Time, The Fate of the Franklin Expedition. And people think of Franklin as being, the great Arctic mystery, all the, people who disappeared, the 2 ships lost. But in fact, much earlier, the James Knight expedition lost 2 ships, and the entire crew, and Knight himself died in that expedition. So I was there with Professor Owen Beatty, who forensic anthropologist, now emeritus at the University of Alberta, and we were trying to understand, what happened to the Knight expedition, just as Owen had earlier tried to understand what happened to the Franklin expedition, whether there were health factors that contributed to the destruction of that expedition. So I was on Marble Island, and it was a remarkable experience. I think one season we spent something like 5 weeks there, and 2 subsequent seasons of research. And it wasn't easy. We were camped. We weren't at least making a trek across a polar ice cap or anything, but we were subject to some pretty severe weather and occasional marauding polar bear visits, the usual sort of terrors of the North and the insects. There was one period where things got really difficult. I think we all were soaked. It reaches, as anyone who's camped will know, that you can sometimes reach a point where, try as you might, you are not dry. Your clothes are not dry. Your sleeping bag is not dry. In fact, nothing's dry. And I think I got kind of hypothermic at one point, suffering from, I think, hypothermia at some level, and certainly was extremely cold. And I was shuddering sort of rhythmically and feeling absolutely miserable, unable to get dry. And I had this odd sensation that I kind of was looking at myself from a different perspective, that I wasn't actually this shuddering kind of pathetic excuse for an explorer, but rather I was sort of hovering above that and that person and kind of taking some pity on him, but it wasn't really me. So in a funny way, I felt almost comforted by that, because that was somebody else who was suffering, and I was doing, I guess, better. So it was a strange experience. I didn't really, I just thought it was kind of a bizarre, it was like hallucination or something, or perhaps psychological coping, given the situation. And when I came back, I mentioned this to a friend who said, "Gee, this sounds a bit like what happened to Shackleton." So I was unfamiliar with the third man experience of Shackleton on South Georgia, and so read up on that. When I did, I did not think that I had a third man experience, because I felt more of a detachment from myself, but I didn't feel that there was an externalized presence there. I recognize whatever externalized presence that was there was me, really. So it wasn't the same thing, but I was really interested in the Shackleton experience, and I began to kind of poke around, and very quickly found other examples much like Shackleton. One of them is Joshua Slocum, Canadian actually, who was the first person to circumnavigate the world solo during a particularly difficult period of his solo journey. He had an experience where he was too ill to really pilot his ship, and felt that there was another entity, another person, a very skilled captain, had taken the helm and was actually guiding the ship safely to harbor. And he described that in his account of his expedition. The other one I found right away was Charles Lindbergh and that famous Spirit of St. Louis flight. And during that, absolutely horrific journey, where he was flying solo across the Atlantic from North America to Europe, Lindbergh had a sense again that there was a period where he was flying through very thick cloud and fog, and had no sense of where the sky ended and the ocean began. It was all just shades of gray, and he was under extreme stress. He had been awake for far too long, and he was feeling like he was going to hit the ocean at some point. He came very close. You could actually feel the moisture of the ocean coming through the fuselage. And again, he felt a presence appear, felt it was a calming, reassuring presence that kept him company, that urged him on, that said, "You can do this." And so each of them very different circumstances, but each of them similar in that there was an externalized presence that appeared, say almost like a spirit or a ghost, or certainly a being appeared and was critical to their ultimate survival. And in case of Lindbergh's success, he triumphed, was the first to cross the Atlantic by airplane. So when I realized there were these different examples, I started to investigate much more deeply, and discovered some early scientific research where neurologists and medical researchers were trying to understand what was going on. Again, just using a couple of these examples. And I think the first thing I set out to do was to show that this was actually fairly common. And I think I succeeded, because my book, The Third Man Factor, and its sequel, The Angel Effect, both have dozens of accounts like this. So this is not something that is kind of a freak hallucination that, one or two people or three people have had, and that just coincidentally are the same. Probably if you canvassed enough people, you would find three people who would tell you, "Yes, I once had a vision of chipmunks carrying heraldic banners, marching in unison." So if you ask enough people, you'll probably find people have had some similar experiences like that. But there's more to this. This is something that actually happens commonly to people. The first book, The Third Man Factor, focused very much on exploration explorers. It's happened to Antarctic explorers. It's happened to climbers. It's happened to solo shipwreck survivors. It's happened to people in almost every conceivable situation. And in every one of those situations, they encountered a being that intervened to help them survive those situations.
I find it interesting, even in your own exploration of what happened to you, you were somewhat reluctant maybe to share that information. And that's something you point out, that while a lot of these explorers kind of credit this presence to saving their lives, they're often very reluctant to address it, and often don't. For years, later, maybe a little time has passed and they've had an opportunity to reflect. But another aspect I find fascinating is kind of the different personalities the presence takes. And I think you point out that it can be something as simple as just the feeling of someone there to a god or an angel or a friend or a family member. Could you dive into that a little bit more about what these people actually experience when they have this encounter with a third man?
Well, what's interesting is that everyone, these examples that I was able to surface, everyone had a sense of a presence, that sort of uniform. There was a being external from themselves there that was powerfully benevolent, that was there to help them. It was like a great friend or a family member or something like that. So everyone felt a presence. What was interesting is that I think people who have this experience then strive to understand what happened to them, and so they will fix an identity to the presence. Or I think a devout person, it would be Christ, or it would be God, or an angel, and so that they assign that identity specifically to the presence. Others, maybe more secular minded, it would be a family member, or it would be someone they could identify, but generally not. I mean, those were the minority of cases that I identified, and the people I spoke to. Generally, people will just say, "No, I felt a presence." They often were able to say whether it was male or female, interestingly. So they could assign a gender, and they would communicate. The presence wasn't just this kind of vague sensation of a being nearby, but rather, they would converse, if you will, with. And I said, "Well, what do you mean? Did you speak to actually verbally? Did you hear a voice speaking to you?" No, it wasn't like that, but I was communicating. We were conversing, but it was a mental, generally a mental conversation. So they are conversing. These presences will encourage them to not give up. Will actually give specific directions. There was one climber who was in a horrific climbing accident. His friend was killed. He was seriously injured. This was in Alberta, and he was critically injured. But the presence was saying things like, "Follow the blood dripping off the end of your nose so you don't walk in circles." Really, sometimes practical advice. In one instance, probably the most striking of all for me, just because it was when I wrote the book very fresh, was Ron DeFrancesco, who was the last person out of the South Tower of the World Trade Center after 9/11. And he was up above the point of impact of the airplane that struck the building. People were trapped above that. The building was almost severed by the impact. And people tried to get down. There was too much smoke, too flames. Stairwell was was damaged. So they went up, and then they realized there was no escape going up. There was no way to get the roof. They were, I guess, hoping to helicopters or something rescue them, but it didn't happen. So Ron went back down. He got to this landing where people were collapsed. Some were unconscious. Some were crying, and they just kind of just given up. They were trapped. They couldn't go through because there's flames and smoke. And Ron was just on this landing thinking, I believe, and when I spoke to him, that was it. He couldn't go any further. And then he had this sense of a presence. Someone was there, and that presence he felt lifted him up and actually guided him down into where no human will willingly go, into the flames, into the smoke and fire. And he was able to break through. Then was urged to go forward, and he was able to run there, move down the stairs through the debris field, through the smoke and the flames, and he came out at the other side, and the lights were on, and it was almost like a normal day in the fire staircase, in that building. So then he passed those very brave, heroic firefighters who went up and sacrificed their lives trying to help other people. So very, very powerful story. All of us can relate to that because we all remember, those of us who are around at least can remember what happened, that horrific day. It's just such a powerful force for survival. It's just so interesting that, when people are alone, or alone together in a very isolated situation, as Shackleton and his two colleagues were. People seem to be able to conjure up or trigger or manifest or invite or receive help from a presence, something, an entity that will help them to overcome the terrors they're facing.
There was kind of a mic drop moment for me reading the book when you mentioned that that gentleman was one of, if not the last person out of the tower he was in that day, which really speaks to the need. If he hadn't heeded that guidance immediately, he wouldn't have gotten out, which, it's mind-boggling to think about these things. And I think we understand, that there's a need for help often in these situations. But you also explore kind of the possible non-supernatural, if you will, elements which might be contributing to these manifestations. What are some of the ingredients that can be involved as far as the physical location, the psychology, the physiology, all of those things going on that might be responsible for us essentially saving our own lives by creating these best of friends, if you will?
Well, I found there was commonality in the sense that there seemed to be multiple triggers. It wasn't just that there was necessarily one stress for people. Often there were multiple stresses. So they might be hypothermic, but also in a area where the landscape or what they were encountering was sort of like a monochrome. It was all like a whiteout situation or things like that, where there's an absence of external stimuli visually, and in other cases it might be a dehydration, or there's often a number of factors that come into play and that I think are serve as triggers for the experience. If you just have one of them, I think it's less likely that somebody would experience this. So sometimes it takes a number of these stresses to accumulate and then kind of push you over the line. And then, as you say, this best friend is manifest to you. I have a whole host of different, I think, underlying factors that are at play that kind of ultimately trigger the third man. The interesting debate is what is it? I think I demonstrated with the two books. The first book, The Third Man Factor, is very focused on exploration. That was sort of the conceit of the book, that this happened to explore. So you have to be out in some very remote place away from other people, for the most part, and experiencing sort of the usual exploratory challenges of those kind of extreme environments for this to happen. And then after the book was published, I was inundated with people contacting me saying, well, yeah, your book is fantastic. And it's exactly what I experienced, except I was in my own living room. and so it suddenly dawned on me that look, I was really interested because I'm in exploration and CEO of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society. We fund and support explorers, so it was an area of real interest to me. But in fact, this is something that happens to all sorts of people. It happens to people who are in house fires. It happens to people who are in near drowning situations. It happens to people who are in light plane crashes. It happens to people in car accidents. It happens to cancer survivors, people who are in life and death struggles with disease. So it really is something that potentially almost anybody could experience. You don't have to be trying to summit Everest for this to happen. It can happen to any of us. So I think that's an important realization. So the fact is, I think I demonstrated with the two books, Third Man Factor and The Angel Effect, that this literally is a real phenomenon that has affected a huge number of people, and probably some of the people watching this broadcast or people that they know will have had this experience. So it's not unusual in that way. It is much more common, I think, than you're willing to admit. And I think you're right that certainly some of the explorers I approached about it, I saw kind of allusions to it. I heard other people, like a climber, would tell me, well, this did happen to so and so, but he never spoken about it. So I'd go to them and say, hey, did this happen? Yes, but I've never spoken about it. Partly because there was a sense of almost embarrassment that this was critical to their survival. What if people thought they were, losing their marbles, either tough kind of He-Man out there battling the elements? They don't want to admit that they were hallucinating or they're having some weird kind of psychological, breakdown. In fact, it's very common. It's happened to countless people. And then the next question is, once we accept that this is not just an hallucination, but it's some sort of mechanism that's helping people survive, or some sort of manifestation that's helping people survive. The next question, well, what is it? What is the source of it? Then the question becomes even more, it becomes more difficult. We've proven that the phenomenon exists, their factor exists. How is it that this is happening, and what is causing it, and what explains it? And it's a difficult one, because for a deeply spiritual person, I think the answer is very simple. It would be that this is God. This is the hand of God. This is an angel intervening. Now, for true believers, that's the case. A lot of the people I spoke to weren't religious people or spiritual people, and they got other explanations. And there is a increasing body of science around the phenomenon. There are different theories. One is that it's a psychological coping mechanism, that it's simply, if we talk to psychologists, they will say, look, human beings are highly social. And when we're facing difficulties, we seek the company of others. We seek a best friend. And so when people are in these terrible struggles, what do? They create a best friend to help them through it, because it's a coping mechanism, a way to help them get past what otherwise might be insurmountable if they felt they were truly alone. And then there's been some very interesting neurological research in recent years, where medical researchers have been able to actually stimulate in the laboratory setting a sense of a presence by using electric probes in the brain, where there's part of the brain, the temporal parietal junction, where if you stimulate it, you will actually induce, even in a lab setting, a sense that there's someone else there, presence, other than the people who are, the researcher and the subject. So that does suggest that the brain has a role in this, and it may be an evolutionary adaptation. I mean, you could imagine, our ancient antecedents out on the savannah, perhaps lost, perhaps hungry, perhaps being preyed on by vicious animals, finding this ability to know that you can be supported when you're lost and alone. And it may be, again, the factor that pushes people over the edge into the realm of survival, where they might just otherwise give up. I could not answer, and I don't think anyone at this stage can answer definitively what is causing it. I mean, even if you make the case that it's neurologically based, or that which appears to be clearly a psychological coping mechanism, you can't ever dismiss the possibility that there may be some greater power at play, because, even if you say, well, this is the brain doing this, then someone deeply spiritual will say, well, God put it there. It's like a button that you push, and you can connect with God or connect with angels. What's fascinating to me is that it happens, that we all have this capacity. And I think if we understood it better, we would be able to call upon it more readily. And I think there's a lot of people who are various reasons in their lives suffering, or needing support, needing that companionship. I think it'd be an amazing thing if we all knew how we could more easily access it, because I don't think we want to be cast adrift in the Pacific Ocean, or end up in the death zone of Everest in a life or death battle in order to have this experience.
My heart was beating very quickly at times reading some of those stories, thinking, "Oh boy, I would not want to be in that spot." An interesting example of kind of the everydayness of it that you mentioned in the book, and a topic that we've explored on the show with psychologists, is imaginary friends when we're kids, which is very common, and kind of speaks to a cure for loneliness or acceptance. But there is something a bit eerie to it as well, especially when you read the reports of people's imaginary friends who told them to do bad things, or had knowledge of events which the child would not be aware of. So maybe we can use that as a segue into chatting a little bit about how the third man may connect to the paranormal. And of course, as I was reading the book, I was thinking that all the time. And I'm wondering your thoughts. I mean, do you think some of the traditional paranormal experiences people have had, paranormal encounters, are just slightly different manifestations of this same kind of phenomenon?
There may be some relationship between the third man factor and some some of the ghost story accounts that I've seen. There's even the alien abduction accounts. What's different about Third Man is that there's this incredible comfort, the sense of benevolence that's associated with the experience, and that's where it's very different. I literally didn't find a single example of a person who was in these situations saying, "Oh yes, I felt a presence, but it was nasty and it was pursuing me and it was contributing to my struggles." That just didn't happen. And you're gentle, Casper like ghosts, but we generally, maybe it's just popular culture, but seems to focus on kind of the really terrifying poltergeist type ghosts, and ditto the alien experiences that are described by people who say that they've encountered them are inherently horrifying or terrifying. So I'm not convinced it's the same phenomenon. I don't know. I've never not looked at those other sorts of experiences in any depth, so I can't really comment on what might be underpinning them. But all of us have experienced, at some level. For example, if you're alone at home, I've had this experience quite commonly, and I'm sure many of your listeners, viewers have as well. If you're alone at home and that house is normally occupied with other people, they're away for the weekend, they're gone for a week. Suddenly you start to be aware of things that are a little kind of frightening. There may be noises in the house or creaks or a sensation that there might be someone watching you, or that you're maybe not alone, but you don't know. It's sort of creepy. When you're walking down a dark alley, you feel the hairs are standing up in the back of your neck, and thinking that there could be a predator, there could be some sort of criminal assailant around any corner. That is that is quite common, that people have commonly, and that's I think it's a slightly different phenomenon, but it's an acute kind of, I think, again, evolutionary response to situations that were inherently threatening for people. They're in jungle, they're in situations where there were predators. So we are highly attuned in those situations to picking up cues of mortal dangers, and then I think we assign, again, people may assign an identity. There's a term "had," which is a way that our brains are responding to these situations, being alone in kind of situations that become kind of frightening, and it's a neurological response to these situations, and I think it's just a way to wake you up to the possibility that there's danger, and maybe you assign, because you are awake to this possibility, then you start to, well, what's causing me to think that there's danger? Well, maybe there's a ghost, maybe there's an alien. Again, I haven't explored, done any research in that area. I was very focused on a phenomenon that is quite different, and which is inherently a powerful survival mechanism, and very benevolent.
You wonder if it's our reptilian brain to some degree, as you say, just giving us a little nudge to pay attention to what's going on around us. You made a good point, which I think is accurate, which is the general perception of the public in regards to the paranormal, and I think largely due to, pop culture, movies, TV shows, and even fiction to some degree, are really focused on kind of the extreme terrifying encounters. But what we have discovered is that the most common paranormal experiences that people report definitely have to do with family members who have passed. And what we found really interesting as we've been doing more and more paranormal investigations at sites, and it may be something like a haunted theater like the Elgin and Winter Garden in Toronto or the SDG Cornwall Jail, is that when people are engaged in this type of activity, they will often believe they connect with the loved one rather than a prisoner at the jail or a former performer who is on stage there. It definitely resonated with me reading the book that this may be part of it. And something we talk about when doing these investigations is the idea of intention and just opening your mind up, perhaps to healing, perhaps to, finding something you've been missing or a loneliness for someone you've missed could all be playing a part here, which is something we continue to explore. And we often ask the question, are places haunted? Are objects haunted? Or are we haunted? And by that, I think we mean, are our own bodies creating these things? And the big question that comes out of that, I think, is, does it matter, or does it make it any less interesting or astonishing that if we're capable of creating these presences, particularly when they're helpful to us? And that kind of leads into my final question. Do you think there are any practical applications for the third man, or the consideration of all the factors involved with the third man, that could be used, for example, for training people to cope with extreme situations, or even helping individuals recover from traumatic events?
It clearly is a very powerful survival mechanism, and I do think that I think there's going to have to be a lot more research into the phenomenon, what's causing it, what is actually happening. Is there an organic explanation? Is this something that is this a displacement of a part of our sense of self, an externalization of that to create a friend at a time when we need a friend to support us and help us through these situations? But I think in time, I think it's quite likely that we will understand how we could evoke these situations. We don't want to go through what these people generally had to go through. But wouldn't it be nice if there were a way that to more readily access this sense of comfort and companionship that comes from this? There are a lot of people who are very lonely, and as you describe, in fact, often, especially with the elderly, when there's a loss of a life companion, there are instances where people will still set a table for two when their partner has been dead for sometimes years, or they will speak to them. They'll feel their presence and be comforted by it. There is a kind of inherent need. Now, if people would reveal that to others, they might think that they're senile, or that they would affix quite a negative label on it. But the truth is that if we could find a way to more readily access this phenomenon, I think it would bring a lot of comfort to people. Individuals who are lonely would never need to feel lonely again if this were something that we could evoke easily. I think there's a lot of research that needs to be done in the area of neurology and brain research, but I do think we will get to a point where we have a much greater understanding of what's happening in these instances. And certainly, you look back at Shackleton's account of the third man, the presence encountered in South Georgia. And, you realize that it was a deeply emotional, powerful connection that he felt. When he spoke about it on stage, he almost couldn't speak about it. It was something that was sort of very profound, very deeply personal, and something he didn't really want to, despite being a great showman, he didn't really want to share. It was sort of drawn out of him, and that's, as I say, and a lot of the people I spoke to, that was similar. They didn't really. I spoke to Reinhold Messner, the great climber, all sorts of people, and they didn't really want to. I kind of had to draw it out of them. This is not something that people speak about easily because it is so personal. It is deeply personal. It's something that is almost touching at their very core. But I do think we'll come to an understanding at some point. But for now, it's just one of those great, powerful mysteries of life. And almost everyone I spoke to who have had the experience felt it was a blessing. They wouldn't have not had the experience in spite of all the terrors they went through to achieve it.
Well, John Geiger, it's been a pleasure to speak with you, and I highly recommend this book to our listeners out there, as it touches on so many of the themes that we discuss regularly on the show, and the stories themselves are absolutely captivating, edge of your seat kind of stuff. John, the book we've been talking about today largely has been The Third Man Factor: Surviving the Impossible. Remind us what the title of the sequel is?
It's called the Angel Effect.
The Angel Effect. I'm putting that at the top of my summer reading list for sure. And John, if people are interested in kind of keeping up with you and your work, where's the best place for them to do that?
Well, I've been really focused on my day job in recent years. I'm the chief executive officer of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society. We publish Canadian Geographic magazine, and we fund adventurous expeditions. You can see there's a bit of commonality in terms of my day job and some of these interests I have, more esoteric interests I have. So it's a nonprofit. We work really hard to disseminate information about Canada, our physical geography and our human geography, and to share some incredible stories about our country and through the eyes of storytellers and explorers. So it's important work we do, and that's what keeps me going.
Well, John, I hope we have the opportunity to chat again at some point in the future, though I very much hope it's not at the top of a mountain or deep under the sea or on a space station or some other place of extreme conditions. Thanks so much, John. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Jim. It's a real pleasure for me as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us for this episode. It was a pleasure to have John Geiger on the show, and I'm very appreciative of the time that he spent with us. I would highly recommend his book, The Third Man Factor, Surviving the Impossible, and the other one that he mentioned in particular was The Angel Effect. Both of these books can be found anywhere you get your books. I would also encourage you to support the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, who do some amazing work under John's leadership. For information about our ghost tours restarting in Toronto, the ghosts of Black Creek Pioneer Village, and campus secret inspectors at the University of Toronto, or any of our ghost tours in Kingston, Ottawa, or Toronto, please visit our website, hauntedwalk.com. Be sure to use that promo code HauntedTalks at checkout to get your 15% off your tickets. Be sure to follow, rate, and review the show wherever you listen, and we hope you'll follow us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, all at Haunted Walk, for our latest updates, spooky memes, and spine-tingling tales. As always, a special thanks to our Haunted Talks team, including Michelle Dennis, our outstanding audio editor. Until we meet again, my friends, sweet dreams.